So after my trip to Cape Town, I was really curious to see how such a small nation such as the Netherlands could have such a broad and widespread impact all around the world. So in this episode, I am speaking to Jos Gommans, who is a professor of history, especially around the Dutch colonial period, and also he's written books about the Indo-Mongol civilization. So in this discussion, we not only talk about the VOC, the Dutch East India Trading Company, but we also talk about and we compare how civilizations and empires have spread, one through the use of horses and the other through the use of ships. So it's a really interesting conversation. The question I wanted to ask in this one is, what was the Dutch East India Trading Company and how did it manage to have such an influence on places such as Cape Town, but also places in Asia as well? And things you will learn in this podcast that you probably wouldn't have expected from a podcast about the Dutch East India Trading Company, because I'm speaking to Jos Gommans, who is an expert in Central Asian empires as well, and learning about the steppe. You'll also hear about the Mongols. And it's a really good conversation because it makes you think about what makes empires spread, trade, different networks of trade, whether that be through the Silk Road or the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you learn a lot. And if you have any questions that come up after this conversation, then please leave comments. And don't forget, if you enjoy the video, to like and subscribe. So let's begin. Welcome back to Joe Chambers' Questions Everything podcast. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Jos Gommans, who is a professor of colonial and global history. He's an expert in the Dutch Empire and also, I believe, the Mongols and the Mongol Empire and trade like that. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Jos, and your sort of expertise, that'd be great.
Yes, so I'm teaching for a couple of decades already in Leiden. So I'm teaching colonial and global history, but my background is more in particular South Asian history. So I look at the world from, let's say, the perspective of the Indian civilization throughout, let's say, the centuries. And that Indian civilization has been impacted by both Central Asia and, let's say, the conquest of Turks and Mongols, establishing the Mughal Empire, which is really my let's say, where my heart is and my passion is. And from that also, you look at the sea, and then you see these European empires emerging. So the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English, and also the French. And I also happen to be in the Netherlands, which also means that we have a wonderful archive, the archive of the Dutch East India Company. So I also worked with that archive, and I wrote a book on the Dutch Empire. Yeah, so so I tend to compare, let's say, early modern medieval empires as a result of that. So have an eye on both the horse and the steppes, and also on the ship, and let's say the overseas trade.
Yeah, amazing. So the reason I wanted to speak to you is because I've just come back from Cape Town and I could see the influence of the Dutch on the southern part of Africa. So many things are named with Dutch names. I know that the Cape of Good Hope was initially sort of rounded by the Portuguese, then more settled by the Dutch. But obviously that was an important trade route in order to get to Asia. And I suppose the connection to the Mongol and that was the trade route with horses, and you could say that the trade route to Asia then became more important for ships, and that's where the European nations were able to come in. What was it that was so important for people to trade between parts of the world that sort of drove the Dutch Empire and these other empires? What were they trading?
Yeah, very good question. First of all, speaking about the Cape route, I think that is the major revolution that is actually starting with the Europeans. So the Europeans
Hmm.
find this new route, but we should not forget that, of course, trade between Asia and Europe is very old. So it started, let's say, a high point in that relationship is the first century AD, because the Romans were already opening up to the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
And so there were linkages all the time. So what we see, let's say, in our period, so we go to the Portuguese and in particular the Dutch Empire, they were very much aware of this ongoing overland trade, beginning with the Silk routes, etc. But they also tried to get a kind of a privileged, monopolized access to the region. And so that was the secret behind the Cape route, which was actually explored by the Portuguese, and Vasco da Gama was the first who actually used that route to arrive in India. But already Vasco da Gama could actually use an Italian, Spanish language in India because there was already knowledge about these connections, and so there was also a kind of exchange of commodities already, and very important from a European point of view is having access to spices like pepper in particular, but also cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon, because these commodities were extremely expensive. And if there was a chance to monopolize these commodities, then you could become extremely rich in a very short moment. And that's exactly what the Dutch tried to do. Also because they didn't want to depend on, let's say, the Iberian powers, the Spanish and also later the Portuguese and the Spanish, because they were combined under a king for quite some decades. But you have to keep in mind that the Dutch were also having their war against Spain, and they tried to become independent. And because of that rivalry in Europe, they also tried to open up their own, let's say, spice routes to what is now Indonesia and also India. And yeah, so I think that's the beginning of things. So it's not entirely new. So there is already a consumer market for these goods, and they are very, very appealing and attractive, and you want to be part of that and actually to control them. And that's the background of the VOC, because the VOC is actually trying to, let's say, collect capital to make this possible, these long trips, very long distances, which took actually almost a year. If you travel from Amsterdam to Indonesia, it's 9 months to a year. And that also means there's a lot of risk involved. So you also need to deal with the risk problem. And so you collect money, you have an insurance in that sense. But in the end, it is about bringing goods back to the Netherlands and then selling them on the market for Europe. And that also means that Amsterdam in particular, the Republic more in general, really becomes a kind of metropole, a kind of a staple market in competition with, let's say, other markets that the Portuguese try to develop.
And what was it about the Dutch that helped them, I suppose, take over some of the Portuguese trading routes and become arguably more successful in this sort of empire?
Yeah, I think the question really is, were they more successful? So they tried to copy the Portuguese, and they spied the Portuguese also to understand, what should be done to establish such an empire. We talk about an empire, but it's actually a network of factories, of offices that were opened at various places, and some of these offices then start to expand with power and using violence, especially in the Indonesian archipelago. And also, I think that so there was a lot of competition with the Portuguese, but also with other Asian merchants. So it would be one-sided to say it's just the Portuguese-Dutch rivalry, but in the end, they were able to beat them because of more capital that they could use against the Portuguese, and with more capital, you could have more ships and better ships. So if you look at the figures, it's also clear that the, let's say, Dutch shipping was more stable than Portuguese shipping. There were far more shipwrecks among the Portuguese. So it's not an easy question to answer. So how were they able to beat them? At the same time, perhaps they didn't beat them because the Portuguese actually continued, and very successfully at some places. So the Portuguese operations were also quite different from the Dutch ones because they were more decentralized. So you have a lot of, let's say, Luso-Asian groups that are active and very successful in Asia, not necessarily under the control of the crown, of the Estado da India, the Portuguese. So it was much more a fragmented, decentralized operation with private groups, which the Dutch were anxious to allow in their own setting, because that would undermine the monopoly that was so important for them. So both tried to really gain a monopoly on, for example, spices. But the first thing the Portuguese did was actually sell these rights of trade, of these monopolies, to private parties. And that was actually something that the Dutch were not doing. And so perhaps despite, let's say, the image that both have, so the Dutch were really centralized, monopolistic, very, very tight control over everything, whereas the Portuguese were much more loose. You would almost say more liberal. And that is, I guess, what you don't associate the Iberians with, that they are liberal and even neoliberal by just selling out everything that makes profit. This is more sounding like Margaret Thatcher, selling out the railways, etc. So that's exactly what the Portuguese were doing. So in a way, they lived next to each other and also competing with each other. But the examples that we have of real confrontation, the Dutch were, quite superior in terms of their shipping and also the weaponry that they could actually mobilize.
And what were the key trading places in Asia for the Dutch?
So there they really learned from what was going on already. So you see the Dutch using the Cape Route, entering into the Indian Ocean, and they enter an environment that's already working pretty well. So it's a very sophisticated economy, the Indian Ocean, with all kinds of circuits that overlap. And what is really crucial to understand in what the Dutch are doing is that there's a monsoon climate in the Indian Ocean, which determines traffic. So if you would have a map of Asia, you see three circuits. So one circuit would be, the first circuit would be, if you enter from the Cape, would be the Arabian Sea. Then you have between India and the archipelago the Bay of Bengal, and then a third circle would be the South China Sea. And these were already existing circuits. So the best way to control trade and also to profit from what's going on already is that you look at the overlap of these three circles. And so, for example, one important overlapping area would be the west coast of India, where you find Goa, for example. And because there you find the goods of the Arabian Sea. So traders would come from the Arabian Sea, from the Middle East. They bring their goods to, for example, Goa, and then go back to the Middle East. So that the circuits really mean that it's what you do and what you travel within a year. So the same happens in places like Malacca. So Malacca was also conquered by the Portuguese, and they control, in that sense, the two more eastern circuits. So you have the Bay of Bengal circuit that overlaps surrounding Malacca, but also where's now Singapore. So that's why also these regions are so important. So you have these overlapping crossroad regions. So if you if you are in a position to conquer them, you really have a kind of control about the main channels of that trade, and that's exactly what the Dutch are doing. But then they also copied it from the Portuguese, and so they conquered Malacca over the Portuguese. So they were kicked out, and the same goes for some other areas also in India. I think that's and I think the Dutch had a very good idea about what was going on. And they knew exactly where to invest and where to conquer and where not to conquer. So they always kept an eye on their purse. That's also quite, perhaps quite unique as a centralized organization for the Dutch Empire.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. There's almost like these key arteries of trade, and there's certain points where it's really important to have control so that you can have your finger on the pulse.
Exactly. Yeah.
What influence did the English play when sort of English East India Trading Company came into it? Did that impede, or how did that impact the Dutch trading empire?
So I think it's so in a way a short answer would be okay. The Dutch copied the Portuguese, but the English copied the Dutch.
Yeah.
People also say the 16th century is Portuguese, 17th century is Dutch, and the 18th century is English. And then, of course, ignoring what's going on in Asia because we still have these huge empires there. So the English, in the beginning of the 17th century, are always, the Dutch label the English always as their friends. So they even beat their friends. They conquer their friends. So they keep referring to the English, and that's because were allies in Europe in the war scene against the Philip II, and the Habsburg
Yeah.
Empire. You know everything, I guess, as an Englishman about the Armada and all that. You know, the Dutch and English were really allies and good friends.
Hmm.
But then what happens? There was even talk about let's say a fusion between the English company and the Dutch company. So in the first decades there was a discussion about that. But what is also clear in the 17th century, especially at the early parts, that the Dutch had more money. So they could actually raise more capital, as I mentioned earlier with the Portuguese. And also because of that capital, they were able to also beat the English, or let's say in the Indian Ocean, especially when, let's say, the beginning of the 17th century, there was still a kind of arrangement that both the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company would be allowed to profit from the spice market in Southeast Asia. But then gradually, and sometimes very violently also, the English were kicked out of Southeast Asia. So the Dutch really could profit from that spice monopoly. And I often tell my students that, you know, the English had only one option, and that's going to India. Where the Dutch had less interest because the big, the big prize was actually spices, and because these were the most profitable in the 17th century. But if we move into the 18th century, spices become less and less dominant in terms of determining the profit of the company, and what really becomes very crucial is textiles. Textiles have always been very prominent. Again, even in Roman times. So the Romans were complaining that all the money of the world was going to India because of its textiles also. So textiles was really an Indian product. And that becomes, in the 18th century, extremely important. And then the Dutch find themselves marginalized because they still are in Indonesia, what is now Indonesia. And the English actually are at the first seat, the first row, where in an economy, in a commodity that really counts. So textile is the product that makes the Indian Ocean go round, so to say. And
You
especially in the
mentioned,
18th century, when there's also an increasing demand for that same commodity in Europe. So there is quite a lot of impact of Indian textiles also on fashion in England, but also in northwestern Europe and in Germany, France. So textiles really is becoming, and also for the Dutch East India Company, Bengal becomes more important. So you see in Bengal that the English and the Dutch live next to each other. They compete with each other also. They keep a very keen eye on each other, what they are doing. So because they are competitors. And then in the 70s, the Dutch are kicked out. So the Dutch, and then the Brits take over in Bengal, and that's the beginning of the British Raj for, let's say, the next century. But then also the English operation in India is a bit different from the Dutch operation in Indonesia, because they start really to finance their whole operation from the land revenue that's coming from the land that they conquer in India.
and what was the state of the sort of incumbents, the people who already lived there? What were the empires or the powers that existed in India and Indonesia? I guess the trading partners for the European nations when they came. What was
Yeah.
that like?
Yeah, so then my other expertise comes in, I would say. So if you think about the Mongols and what is their power, what is their success story, I would say it's really warfare on the basis of horses, horse breeding, massive cavalry, the mounted archer, etc. So if you look at the map of Eurasia, you can see a huge legacy of that tradition. So the Ottoman Empire in Middle East, the Safavid Empire in Iran, and especially also the Mughal Empire. The Mughal also means in Persian Mongol. So it already refers to where the power of these Mughals came from Central Asia, and the access to cavalry, strong cavalry and horses. So it also means that in these arid zones, and it includes also China, because there's also the Great Wall in China, which is also telling you the story about China's relationship with the steppes. So keep out the Mongols, but of course it doesn't work. And we know that the Manchu dynasty, which came up in the 17th century in China, is also a Central Asian dynasty, having that same kind of dynamic that the Mongols had in West Asia, in the Middle East and in South Asia. So in these areas, the Dutch were just standing in the queue, asking for privileges. May I trade in your empire? So that's so I often compare the Europeans with the Mongols of the sea. So what you see is that the sea becomes dominant
Mm.
in Europe at some point. So the sea is very conducive for trade. It's better to, I think it's more profitable and more efficient to do trade with a ship than with mules or with carts, with bullocks or whatever. So I think, especially in the period that we are talking about, overseas trade is more efficient, and it requires also a different kind of warfare. So you have these merchantmen with cannons that really call the shots in the Indian Ocean. And so that means that the maritime regions, in particular the archipelago, but also islands like Ceylon, so what is now Sri Lanka and
Yeah.
Taiwan, also become very much under the influence of these Europeans because these are maritime areas.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to conquer Indonesia with a horse. Yeah, so you see that there's a kind of a balance between these, this Mongol logistics of state formation and the maritime dynamic. And of course, the two come together, but they really face each other much later in the 18th century. As I mentioned already, when you see that these English soldiers using very standardized modern muskets with standardized bullets, and especially in drill and discipline, are in a position to really beat these Mongol armies with let's say these armies with a Mongol tradition that is more horse-based.
Mm.
And so I think that is basically the story why you see the first Europeans settling along the coast and having no impact whatsoever into the interior, especially in the arid areas of Eurasia, where there is a lot of leeway for cavalry and these empires.
Did the Mongols have access to gunpowder and muskets themselves?
So if you refer to the Mongols, it's often 13th century, and if you
Yes.
refer to the Mughals, it's
Okay.
India.
Yeah.
They had cannon, and they also
Yeah.
had gunpowder. So there still even talk about, even in the 16th century, about gunpowder empires, which refers
Hmm.
to these big Islamic empires, Ottomans,
Yeah.
Safavids in Iran, and the Mughals. But I have written a book against this idea that I know for me it's really important to stress that cavalry, let's say, horse-based warfare really remains way more important than cannon. Certainly way more important than musketry and infantry. So the entire army of these three states, well, the Ottoman, it's perhaps a more nuanced story because they also have a let's say a military scene in Europe. They also fight the Habsburgs in Austria and in the Balkan. So again, but that's getting us far from trade. But for sure, I think that's so there's a kind of a situation where the Europeans gradually start to perfectionize their infantry warfare, and at some point you start at a level that they can really beat the other, because they
Hmm.
really have, as I said, they have perfectionized. What would be the English word? They have perfected
Perfected.
the way
Yeah.
of warfare. Yeah, as
Um, uh,
infantry. And then also I think so when they, and that also means that if you look at how the Brits conquer India, it's from the coast. So Madras, Calcutta, Bombay, and so and then they go inland, controlling more and more land, and with the revenue coming from the land, they can actually pay for their armies. So that also means they become less, let's say, dependent on commodities and trade as in the old days. And the Dutch, of course, operate in a completely different world. So we are in a tropical Asia where you don't have these, you don't have to fight very, very, let's say, great cavalry armies. But still, there you still have some very important sultanates on Java, Mataram, for example. You have Aceh on Sumatra. And they give the Dutch a hell of a time. So they also compete with them. And that's only gradually that also the Dutch start to control the coast, the entire coast of Java, for example. They already controlled the Maluku Islands because of the spice trade, and also wiped out entire populations there as a result of that. But that was, of course, also in the Dutch case, every region has its own story. So we didn't talk about Japan and China. So the Dutch also had a different role to play there. So it's a very diverse empire which has to be told per region. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly what we did in our book. Is we start to speak about the Dutch always from the inside out. So we start from, let's say, the regional kingdom of Kandy in Sri Lanka, and then go to the coast and see what's happening there. But it also it has a disadvantage because you lose track of the big picture. But the big picture is more or less as I tried to tell you in the last minutes.
And what did the influence of Europe's context at the time with the Habsburgs Empire have on the fact that it was places like the Netherlands, which were seeking independence, have on the fact that they grew and then the Habsburgs Empire sort of came to an end?
Yeah, so I think there's always a kind of a world historical pattern here that we should keep an eye on. So what you see, in a way, the Dutch Republic was very fragmented, also not very centralized, but it's part of the Rhine Delta, if you like. So the Dutch revolt against Spain is also a movement of independence, also because the Dutch no longer want to give too much money and income and of their wealth to the empire. So that's what is happening quite often. You see it the same as you see in Bengal. So Bengal is also the delta of the Ganges River. So when the economy is going well, is growing fast, then the local dynasty has an opportunity to defend itself against the empire that is further up into the interior and becomes independent. So I think that is, let's say, the dynamic in Europe. So the Dutch don't want to, want to really become independent, also keep, let's say, the wealth of their country to themselves instead of paying taxes or, listening to what the emperor in Brussels is telling them. Yeah, so in that sense, what is quite unique about the Dutch is that they start an empire, whatever that means, as a republic. So they don't have a king themselves, which is also unusual. And so, and that was also actually a problem for them in Asia, because as diplomats, so they want to have privileges at the Mughal court, for example, or at the court in Persia, and they introduce themselves. But then the question is, where is your king? Do you have a letter of your king? And the Dutch only had a States General, and perhaps the best option would be that they would tell, okay, we have a stadtholder, but the stadtholder is not a king. And so in terms of diplomatic status and honor, they really had a difficult position, also compared to the Spanish, the Portuguese and the English, who had a king. And so in that sense, it's they were struggling, you could say. At the same time, also, perhaps for them, operating without a king also made life a little bit easier, because it was not that honorable, not that much honor was involved in operating. So they could actually have more leeway to operate as they liked. But that is just speculation. But it was a difficulty to really explain what a state general is, a parliament. So the state general is a parliament, and so they even struggle to find the right Persian word when they are with the Shah in Persia to explain it. And I guess that and also the English also played jokes with the Dutch by saying, they don't even have a king. Often they also showed a map of Europe and showing, do you know how small this country is? These people really, make a show of what they are doing. And do you know how important they really are in Europe? And then showing a map, and then you could see how small the Netherlands actually is. So that's the situation in Europe, and how it was also translated into the diplomatic circuits in Asia.
And what were the internal dynamics of the Netherlands with Belgium becoming separate to the Netherlands itself?
Yeah, so Belgium, of course, was not existing at that time. So it really became independent in 1830. So that's much later. So
Yeah.
what you see is that Belgium, so it's a kind of the war scene it's freezing. So the southern Netherlands, the southern Low Countries, remain under Spanish control, which also mean that it cannot really develop in terms of creating its own overseas empire. although there were attempts, let's say from the place of Ostend, to create a distinct company also for the southern Netherlands, but it never really developed for various reasons of control in the southern Netherlands itself, but also because they had to compete with the Dutch in Asia. So that was also not easy. So they had but of course you have to keep in mind that in the revolt, so if you look at the people that were so prominent in the Dutch East India Company, these were Dutchmen, but actually they came from the southern Netherlands. So before Amsterdam, there was Antwerp. So Antwerp became isolated through a siege during the conflict, and never really could develop itself after that as a kind of international market. Also because of the religious conflict, lots and lots of, let's say, rich merchants from the south, they moved to Amsterdam. So if you look at the people that really are in charge of the company or in charge of other businesses, I would say, okay, I'm not entirely sure, I would say 40%, 30, 40, 50% would be Southern Netherlanders in origin. So, so in that sense also there was a kind of a flight of capital from the south to the north as a result of the outcome of the Dutch revolt. And
And
many of these refugees were also Protestants. So
yeah,
we tend to think that the south is Catholic and the north is Protestant, but because that is also because of this situation that people just try to find a safe haven in the
yeah.
north.
And how important in terms of financing these trips were like the introductions of the stock market and buying stock and shares in these trade missions? How important was that to the Dutch success?
I think it was important. So if I, it's about 6.5 million, if I'm not mistaken, that was raised at the beginning of the start of the Dutch East India Company. So and lots of people invested their money into this company. So it's in a way it's to have a kind of a public stock company is something that's really new in the early 17th century. And it's so it I think without having that, it would be very difficult to raise such an amount of capital. But I always compare it with, let's say, India at the same time, at about the same time in history. So what you see is that in places like India and also China, a lot of money is circulating. So to have a very good institution like the stock market or a company like the VOC also is telling us something about um, the problems of raising money in Europe. Because you need an institution to back it up and to organize it. Whereas if I would be in Delhi or it would be in Surat, a harbor in one of the most important harbors in India, I think it was fairly easy to raise a lot of money for trade, for example. So these institutions that become so important, also the bank, a national bank and a national debt, something that also was introduced in England after the Glorious Revolution. So I think these institutions, who are also very much representative of the great success story of the rise of the West, but they also come from a situation where it is not that easy to raise so much capital, and where you need institutions to organize it for you. So I think that is a kind of a background story that is often missing if you read about that. So keep in mind, I think coming from the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, 16th century, Asia is by far more wealthy, sophisticated than Europe. So it's only gradually in the 17th century that there creates a kind of balance, and then the 18th century, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, Europe really takes over from Asia, actually exporting these textiles that were first imported from India, now exporting Indian textiles produced by machines in England. So that's also a crucial shift in the late 18th, early 19th century.
So who
And the
were the
Dutch are
big,
still depending on their monopolies. The Dutch
yeah,
go on depending on their monopolies because some people, a small elite, group of elites, still become extremely rich as a result of these monopolies. So it's not so much that the Dutch society as a whole profits really from these monopolies, but a small group that are in power really profits from it. And at some point, second half 18th century, another commodity really becomes very important. That's opium, opium from Bengal. And then also there's a small group of people based in Batavia, partly based in Amsterdam, that try to monopolize that commodity too. So it's So for me, the VOC is not so much a kind of a symbol of a new kind of capitalism, but it's also a way to become rich. So it's more a kind of an institutional facade behind which there's a lot of individual and private profit, which you can still see in Amsterdam. If you look at all these houses, these were partly built with the money coming from the VOC, but that's not, of course, that's not state income.
So who were the most profitable members of the VOC? The Elon
Yeah, good
Musks of their
question.
day.
So we call them regenten. So the Dutch word is regents. So yeah, middle class people. These people that started coming from what you call Belgium, so coming from the south, investing in the company, and then becoming rich because they have also a finger in every dish that is being offered from Asia, so to say. Yeah, so it's an upcoming middle class with a that is becoming more and more conspicuously consuming, so to say. That's a small group of people that live in Amsterdam and that marry into the Dutch nobility, which is a small group in the Netherlands, but there's a kind of, at the end of the 17th century, there's a real interesting alliance between people that are managing the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and they marry into Utrecht nobility, for example. So they have their manors also outside Amsterdam in the Vecht region, and they really feel kind of a little aristocrats with their own little castles. But of course their background is rather modest. So they really have this, as I mentioned, this background, 16th century, often coming from the south, being really lower middle class, and then they become extremely rich. And they have also a very close position to the stadtholder. So they advise the stadtholder. The stadtholder also needs them for borrowing money for their support in his own network. So that's the Dutch in the 18th century. That's the Netherlands in the 18th century, I would say, which have been criticized, of course, because it's outsiders often considered extremely corrupt, lazy. It lost its dynamic. People just lived from their rents, etc. So that's the basic story about the 18th century that people also have criticized. But I think basically, if you compare it with the 17th century, it is basically still there, I guess.
So when did because there is a royal family in the Netherlands now, right?
Yeah.
When did that come into
Yeah,
place?
absolutely. Yeah.
And was that as a result of the wealth
Yeah.
created through?
So we have another project on how, let's say, the royal family also profited from the empire. So we call it the Orange Project. So some of my colleagues are actually involved in that. So it's very interesting, and we still await the results coming from that. But the basic question is, of course, the Netherlands were conquered by Napoleon. So before the French conquest, there was still the stadtholder. And after Napoleon, there was William I, the first king of the Netherlands. So then the Netherlands becomes a monarchy. And then later on in 1848, a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, etc., etc. So it's more or less what we still have. It's coming from 1848, when the constitution was made by a guy named Thorbecke, who was a liberal politician. So, but before that, there was just the stadtholder. And so there was no king, as I mentioned. And so, the Dutch, they tried to find a king when they won against the Spanish. Okay, we need a king. Elizabeth was asked, Elizabeth I. So there were some candidates, but at some point they decided, no, okay, let's do without a king. And that means that sovereignty lies with the states. That means the regional parliaments. And the Netherlands is actually the Netherlands in plural, because we have 7 provinces. and these 7 provinces are called the 7 states, and they have the sovereignty, and every state can elect a stadtholder. So the stadtholder works not for God, he works for the for the parliaments, so to say, and that's just the stadtholder. And if you're going to explain this to the Persian Shah, he will start to laugh. So because he is actually indeed working for God, for something that is divine and not for the people. Of course, he's good for the people. He's just to the people, but his inspiration and its legitimacy comes from top down. So the Netherlands are in that sense quite unique, that already in the late Middle Ages you have this kind of bottom-up sovereignty. And then because of this, what happened during the revolt, that they couldn't find a king, they decide, okay, that's it. That's what we are. But you cannot explain that in an Asian context.
In terms of Central Asian history, if there was any particular characters that it would be worth looking into, doing some research about, who would you recommend?
What do you mean exactly? Whom to recommend as a researcher?
No, like notable characters from history, so leaders or
Oh, yeah.
great people or great events, maybe would be a better way of putting it.
Yeah. So if you think about world conquest, then you first think about Genghis Khan. After Genghis Khan, there was let's say the last big conqueror was Timur,
Yeah,
Timberlane in English. And we have also theater pieces and literature a lot about Timberlane, because the idea was the real empire is actually in the east somewhere. And there was also the idea that perhaps the Mongols could help us Europeans against Islam. So you think about the Crusades, 11th, 12th century, and then the Mongols, Genghis Khan is 13th century. So there was this idea, okay, perhaps we can open a second front against the Islamic world, against the Caliphate. And then later on, of course, the Mongols, when they conquered the Middle East, they were converted into Muslims. It took a while, but that happened also later in the 13th, 14th century. So but of course, this is all about logistics. So as I mentioned, the Dutch conquered Indonesia because it was a maritime region. So all these islands were easy to reach for the Netherlands, for the Dutch fleet. Also very effective in using cannon on these fleet. So that's the real trick that made the difference. But if you think about Europe and the Mongols, Europe does not have space for Mongol invasion. So it's not an arid zone, so you don't have the good grasses, you don't have the right meadows. So what you see is that the Mongols actually conquer easily Eastern Europe into Hungary, which is actually the last extension of the arid,
yeah,
the steppes, if you like. But they have so many logistical problems moving on into. So I cannot imagine a Mongol army operating in the Rhine, along the Rhine River, so to say, because that's in terms of logistics. We are dealing with thousands and thousands of horses, and also with their families, with cattle, dromedaries, whatever you can imagine. So these are huge operations, so Europe was actually the odd one out in Eurasia, and that's also why they can develop both as a company. So you can develop in terms of in capitalist terms, perhaps, because there's a lot of, let's say, continuity in cities, for example, that you
yeah,
don't see in places that actually have been affected by these invasions from Central Asia. So Europe has a really deep and long-term continuity compared to places in South Asia, for example. And at the same time, they could actually develop and perfect, that was the term, and perfect their infantry warfare. There was no need to deal with a lot of cavalry. In the beginning, I think there is one visit of the Dutch East India Company diplomat to the Mughal Empire, and then the Mughal Emperor is asking, "Now, do you have warfare in Europe?" And then, yes, we have warfare. And then, so how do you do it? And then they give a kind of show how to exercise and drill in Europe. It's 17th century. But I think for the Mughals, it looked more like a dance festival or something like that. So they could not really understand how this could become effective.
Mm.
But at the moment you have drill and discipline, which was there already, and you give people muskets and you can fire all the time, and then you do it in ranks so that you can keep up the firepower, then it really becomes impressive. But then we are in the 18th century. But what we should not forget is that Europe could actually, from the Middle Ages onward, it could develop this kind of infantry warfare, and at some level, okay, it's less effective, not very sophisticated, but at some point it keeps developing, and then at some point it's actually defeating these cavalry armies, and that's why I think the 18th century is crucial, because then also these maritime empires are in a position to go into the interior, take their muskets, take their cannon, and there's at the beginning it's very difficult to defend yourself against these lethal weapons.
So did these Central Asian empires contract as a result of Europe being able to expand by their newfound methods of warfare?
Yeah. So yeah, of course the story is quite complicated. So, for example, Genghis Khan conquered a lot of a huge empire, but then it fell also because of succession and let's say conflicts about the succession. So it's very difficult to keep these empires together. But the most important empires were not the Mongols themselves, but the post-Mongol empires or the Mongol successor states. So the Mongols, they become the Yuan dynasty in China. Later in Iran, they become the Ilkhanid dynasty as they conquer Iran. In India, we have the Mughal dynasty. And what is really important to understand these empires and the continuity and the power that they have is that they don't stick to the steppes. They go into the wealth of China and India. So they are in a position to take control, for example, over Beijing or over Delhi. That's easily conquered, let's say, from the steppes. But then comes the big challenge. So they cannot sit on their horse and administer their empire. So they have to go to Bengal. They have to go to Gujarat. In China, they have to go to South China, which is far more wealthy than North China. So they have to build a kind of a strategic bridge from their capitals, which are more kind of very close to the steppes and to the arid zone, and then they have to make a bridge to these wealthy areas, which often are rice-based, populous, very extremely wealthy, and you control them from, let's say, these capitals, which are a little bit further away. And that's But in a way, I think a city like Amsterdam is not so different from a city like Delhi. So Amsterdam is a coastal city like London. And so why are these coastal cities so important? Because indeed, it's the same thing. You are close to the sea, so a trading route network. At the same time, you also have an interior, you have a kind of how you call it, a back, let's say a hinterland.
Yeah.
And so Delhi also, if you look at the map of Asia, Delhi is a kind of a harbor because it's very close to the arid zone. So where you can still march with your huge cavalry. So you have to stop in Delhi because further on you start to having problems in terms of logistics. And there's also the Ganges River.
Yeah.
So I always work in terms of global history with these two massive kind of geopolitical areas. So one is the sea, and Europe really becomes dominant on the sea. So the rise of Europe is the rise of the sea.
Yeah.
The rise of the Mongols is the rise of the continental routes of the steppes, and so in that sense it also explains why I'm interested in these two. That's but then clearly 19th century Britain rules the waves, but Genghis Khan rules the steppes. So to say.
Yeah. Two mediums of transporting.
From 1200 to 1900. Yeah, exactly. So the one is the Silk Route, and the other is the maritime route. So I think both are really also now bestsellers. There's this one book on the Silk Route that you can find everywhere. And there's the other book by William Dalrymple on the maritime trade. And actually Dalrymple, when he introduces his book, he is saying, yes, what about this buzz about, about the Silk Road? The maritime routes are far more important. And then he starts also at a very early stage with the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. These are two networks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating. I've loved hearing all about the Dutch Empire, but also about Mongols and their influence on the steppes. I would love
You
to
didn't
speak to
really
you
stick to
again.
the Dutch, I'm afraid.
But that's great. I
Yeah.
mean, this is just learning about history and how sort of the world has evolved. And I think a key theme from this, like you said, is the kind of medium by which empires can spread or trade is conducted and cultures can converge. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. I'm saying this as the sun is shining right in my face. It's probably a good time for us to end this chat.
Yeah, thank you for some very good questions. So they were not easy.
Well, you're more than capable of answering them. And yeah, is there anything that you would like to recommend to anybody who's listened to this conversation?
I would recommend to travel because it's still possible. So you really start to understand empires, also the empires that we are talking about, if you see these places. So go to Malacca, go to places like Surat, go to the Moluccas. So although perhaps I should also be careful because it's not that good for the environment to make all these long trips. But
Unless you go by
yeah,
horse.
so for me, yeah, let's take a horse or a ship. Let's say a sailing ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And put the horse on the ship,
But
and then
it
you
is
get to do
true,
both.
when I was doing my research in London. Sorry?
Sorry, I was just saying you could put the horse on the ship, and then you're able to travel inland and by water.
That's not a good idea because horses don't get seasick. So if you really are interested in horse trade, horses die if they are taken overseas, many of them at least, because you cannot vomit, and then they die. So that's why horses that are traded overseas are far more expensive than overland horses. So
Interesting.
that was my first book I wrote on horse trade and the Afghans, but that's a different world. So don't do that. So either a horse or a ship, that's fine.
That's a brilliant bit of knowledge to finish on. Thank you so much for your time, and yeah, I look forward to speaking to you again about all of these topics. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah. Thank you.
That was fascinating. I really wish that conversation could have gone on a little bit longer, and I would love to speak to Jos again. So a big thank you to Jos Gommans, Professor Jos Gommans, for spending time speaking to me about all of that fantastic knowledge. If you're interested in learning more about the stuff that he's done, he's written some books, such as The Rise of the Indo-Afghan Empire, and he's also been a co-author of a book that is fairly comprehensive look into the Dutch Empire and its influence on the different countries. I'm sure you'll be interested to learn more about that. I'll definitely do some more research myself and would like to explore more about colonial history, whether that be from the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, English respects, and also the other empires that have formed around the world. I love history. I'm sure if you've listened this far, you do too. So I'll continue to ask questions all about how do we get here? What is the influence of all these nations that have empires on today's world? And I'll keep questioning everything, as should you. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.